level. But now, on a local level, Quebec's provincial human rights commissions have proposed legislation which, if passed, will give the human rights commissions expanded powers to punish people who say anything negative about Islam. The legislation, referred to as Quebec Bill 59, is, quote, an act to prevent and combat hate speech and speech inciting violence. After the terror attacks in Canada, Jacques Fremont, president of the Quebec Human Rights Commission and former director of George Soros's Open Society Institute, pointed out that Canada is suffering from mass numbers of citizens leaving the country to join ISIS. Somehow, he and the bill's proponents believe that terrorism is a reaction to people who criticize their religion. And so by banning criticism of Islam, they believe they can stop terrorism. If the bill passes, the human rights commissions and tribunals will be given the power to sue for hate speech, what we call in legalese sua sponte, which means on its own initiative, without a complainant. And everyone will have standing to file a complaint, even if they're not an injured party. Complaints can be filed anonymously, and the human rights commissions will pick up the tab for both the investigations and the prosecutions, all at taxpayer expense, and the defendants will be on their own regarding attorney's fees. The human rights commissions have no objective standards regarding the admissibility of evidence. Evidence is admissible based solely on the judge's discretion. Defendants will not have the right to cross-examine witnesses, including their accusers. Those found guilty will be subject to fines ranging from $1,000 to $20,000 and will have their names put on a list which will be posted on the internet for an indefinite term. Fremont asserts that he plans to use his newfound powers to sue those who, quote, write against the Islamic religion on a website or a Facebook page, unquote. But Canada already has hate speech laws built into its criminal code, which, if violated, are tried in a criminal court with legitimate rules and procedures. As you can see, the Human Rights Commissions have much laxer rules, but even these can be dispensed with at the judge's discretion, which means there really are no rules at all. Accordingly, cases that would never survive in a legitimate criminal court wind up succeeding in Canada's Human Rights Commissions, often referred to as kangaroo courts. If Bill 59 passes, it's unlikely that its impact will be confined to Quebec, especially given the sweeping win by the most recent election by liberals who clearly have a pro-Islam bent. The positions advocated in Quebec Bill 59 to silence speech critical of Islam are doomed to spread to human rights commissions in other provinces around the country. So Section 13 has finally been discarded and is in danger of being replaced with an act that is even more pernicious. But the insanity doesn't stop there. In early October, the Quebec Solidaire leader, François David, set forth a motion in the National Assembly, quote, condemning Islamophobia and calls for hatred and violence toward Quebecers of Muslim faith, unquote, with a particular emphasis on hostility toward Syrian refugees. Because as you saw last week in France, the problem is that Westerners are bigoted and hostile toward Muslim refugees, and not that some Muslim refugees hate infidels. David argued that there are simply too many messages and images on social media that are, quote, racist and Islamophobic, and that she would have the same kind of reaction if homosexuals were similarly attacked. The Canadian immigration minister chimed in that this motion was an act of responsibility and on the part of the legislature, demonstrating respect for the rights and liberties of citizens. The immigration minister erroneously believes that liberty includes a right not to be offended, a totally concocted right absent from all international human rights documents, And she prioritizes this right over the right to free expression, which actually does constitute a human right. David added that the debate regarding whether female Muslim immigrants should be allowed to wear a face veil called a niqab during their citizenship ceremonies is adding to the hostilities. Originally, there were protests from conservative quarters against David's motion for the selective attention given to so-called Islamophobia. Suggestions were made to condemn hatred in all of its forms, and additionally to denounce radical Islam. All of these suggestions were rejected. But ignoring their own weak-kneed protestations, in the end, every single conservative in the legislature voted in favor of the anti-Islamophobia measure, and the motion passed unanimously. And just so you know, there have been numerous Islamophobia conferences popping up all over Canada and America, the goal of which is to silence and stigmatize all discussion that acknowledges Islamist goals that are antithetical to freedom, national security, or human rights. It is therefore of great significance that the Knights of Malta have recently come out with a mandate calling on all of its knights and dames to contact their local, political, and diplomatic leaders to oppose the ideas advocated by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in Resolution 1618. The Order of Malta is an ecumenical religious order affiliated with the Catholic Church and dedicated to caring for the sick and poor. It's a prestigious organization with a permanent presence in 55 countries. Considered a sovereign entity, it has permanent observer status in the UN and diplomatic relations with over 100 countries. This move by the Knights of Malta demonstrates that at least some are waking up to the grim reality regarding the consequences of the OIC's actions and are dedicated to sounding the much-needed alarm in their respective countries. Obviously, the West has a lot of work to do if we are to preserve our precious freedoms, and it's worth noting that our own very Valerie Price has recently been bestowed with the great honor of having been inducted into the Knights of Malta. She's now officially Your Royal Highness. Always was. Other examples in Europe were the criminal prosecution of Dutch Member of Parliament Geert Wilders, who was charged with public insults based on religion and incitement to hatred for expressing his view that Islam is a hateful religion, and for producing Fitna, a negative film about Islam. In France, Brigitte Bardot, an actress and animal rights activist, criticized the ritual slaughter of sheep during the festival of Eid, a Muslim holiday. She was fined 15,000 euros and was actually convicted for similar comments no less than 5 times. In Helsinki, Finland, a council member was convicted for making negative comments about Muhammad's marriage practices. In Denmark, Sweden, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and elsewhere, filmmakers, publishers, authors, and others have been criminally prosecuted for denigrating Islam. In America, the uniqueness of the First Amendment provides an almost absolute right to freedom of speech. It does not balance offense against freedom the way they do in Europe, and it guards against the passage of hate speech laws. But truthful comments about Islamic terrorism and Islamist ideology still give way to political correctness, willful blindness, and plain naivete. For example, just recently, Curt Schilling, legendary baseball player and ESPN announcer, sent a tweet stating that, quote, only 5 to 10% of Muslims are extremists. In 1940, only 7% of Germans were Nazis. How did that work out? Despite the fact that the tweet was accurate, he was suspended from his job duties. And by using societal pressures, name-calling, and giving the false impression that America is rife with anti-Muslim bigotry, Muslim Brotherhood front groups strong-arm, litigate, boycott, and threaten individuals, corporations, and government agencies into self-censorship. Imagine an America where corporations are changing their products, their package designs, and even their own internal production procedures in capitulation to Islamist demands. Imagine an America where prestigious universities are intentionally indoctrinating students with apologist ideology and false information about Sharia law and Islamist goals, and where public schools are brainwashing children with textbooks that totally rewrite history. Imagine an America where Hollywood portrays terrorists as anyone except for Muslims in order to appease pressure groups, and where TV shows and films have been altered to meet Islamist approval. Imagine an America where public speakers, churches, prayer leaders, and even politicians are afraid to express their views or opinions, or even to ask legitimate questions regarding the critical issues of Islamic terrorism, Islamic persecution of religious minorities, or human rights violations committed in the name of Islam due to fear of being called an Islamophobic bigot. I want you to imagine all of that. But most of all, I want you to imagine, if you can, an America where federal agencies designed to protect the national security of American citizens voluntarily reduce their own ability to do just that, based on advice from Islamists who often have no knowledge or background or interest in American national security. I wish I could tell you that the Orwellian picture of America, which I just depicted, will be the future America if you don't wake up. But the truth is, that's the America that I live in now, because you don't know it because the media doesn't report it. Let's take CARE, for example, Council on American Islamic Relations, one of the most prominent Muslim Brotherhood front groups in America. CARE holds itself out as a Muslim Brotherhood, as a Muslim civil rights organization, but it's really a Muslim Brotherhood front group. It was an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation trial, the largest terror financing trial in the history of the United States. And it spawned out of Hamas and the Islamic Association of Palestine, both of which are state-designated terrorist organizations. It's based in both the US and Canada. And by the way, the Canadian branch of CARE is now called the National Council of Canadian Muslims, having changed its name after the Holy Land Foundation trial and the bad press that it got from all the convictions. Now all of a sudden it has a different name. CARE is basically the propaganda wing of Hamas in America and Canada. In 1996, Nike, a Fortune 500 company, came out with a sneaker called Nike Air. It had the logo Air on the back. A Muslim saw the logo and thought it looked like the word Allah in Arabic. CARE found out about it and demanded that Nike change the logo. At first, Nike resisted. But after persistent pressure and threats of a global boycott of the entire company in every single country, including the Middle East, not just a boycott of the sneaker, eventually Nike caved in to the demands. It apologized to Muslims worldwide. It changed their own internal production procedures to ensure that future logo designs don't defame Islam. It made a global recall of all the sneakers that were already in distribution centers and completely ate the costs. And it donated tens of thousands of dollars to several Islamic schools, Islamic charities, it sponsored Muslim community events, and it gave $50,000 to Dar al-Hijra, which is a very radical mosque in Virginia. Liz Claiborne Jeans is licensed to distribute DKNY jeans. It came out with jeans that had a Quran verse on the back pocket. Both DKNY and Liz Claiborne have stores in the Middle East, but these jeans were only sold in America. CARE claimed, in effect, that it was blasphemy because when you sit down in the jeans, it's like sitting on the Quran, and demanded an apology to all Muslims worldwide, a change in their internal design processes, a requirement that all the employees attend sensitivity training, and that DKNY dispose of the jeans in a manner that's approved by Islamic scholars. I think they had to burn the jeans, not just throw them out. And DKNY capitulated on every single point. These examples are not anomalous. Companies that you do business with every day, like Burger King, Bank of America, MasterCard, Life Magazine, and UPS, have all been threatened with boycotts or demands for retractions, and most of them have capitulated. Simon & Schuster Publishing, U.S. News & World Reports, and the Philadelphia Inquirer have all been threatened for material they either published or were planning to publish. Robert Spencer, Noni Darwish, Joe Kaufman, Bruce Taft, Paul Harvey, and Juan Williams have either been threatened, shut down, or fired due to pressure from Muslim Brotherhood front groups for speech that is constitutionally protected. And universities like Georgetown, Harvard, and Berkeley offer an onslaught of pro-Islam classes, workshops, and seminars, all funded with Saudi money. But even in Hollywood, CARE has had undue influence, insisting that any film about Islamic terrorists constitutes, quote, negative stereotyping of Muslims, unquote, and should therefore be censored. For example, The Sum of All Fears, a film based on the book by Tom Clancy, starring Ben Affleck, had a plot that showed Muslim terrorists shooting down an Israeli jet over Syria, which was carrying nuclear weapons. CARE lobbied the producers for 2 whole years prior to the film's release, and eventually got the villains changed to Australian neo-Nazis. I haven't seen the film, but I heard it makes no sense now. Kingdom of Heaven starred Liam Neeson and Orlando Bloom. It was about the Crusades and the battle for Jerusalem. 20th Century Fox, the producer, had already had numerous run-ins with CARE. To avoid further problems with them, the producers hired a Muslim consultant who is anti-Islam, who is anti-Israel, and views America as racist. The producers also gave CARE special treatment by providing them with a pre-screening of the film. As a result, they wound up cutting several scenes, and in the end, the movie depicted the Christians as murderers and hypocrites, and the Muslims as morally superior.
Big surprise.
CARE also protested the film's executive decision, starring Kurt Russell and Halle Berry, The Siege, starring Bruce Willis and Denzel Washington, and True Lies, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jamie Lee Curtis. It's important to understand that none of the films alleged that all Muslims are terrorists, but CARE wants no Muslims to be portrayed as terrorists. CARE wants terrorists to be portrayed as anybody except for Muslims. And still, all the films I mentioned and others wound up cutting scenes, altering them, or making disclaimers that said this film doesn't represent Islam or a particular religion, or made other concessions in order to appease CARE. But it's not just Hollywood that CARE wants censored, it's radio too. As some of you might have heard, CARE was instrumental in getting Michael Graham fired from WMAL Radio. He was the show host, for voicing his opinions which were critical of Islam, despite the fact that he gave his opponents an opportunity to air their views, and he cleared it with management prior to the show. And remember, it's a commentary show. It's not news. He just stated his opinion and asked, what do you think, in the audience? Then CARE launched a campaign against Michael Savage, pressuring his sponsors to stop airing commercials on his show. Over 20 companies pulled their ads, including JCPenney, Geico, Sears, Sprint, Walmart, OfficeMax, and others. CARE then started a campaign called Hate Hurts America, targeting additional conservative radio show hosts like Glenn Beck for their, quote, Islamophobic rhetoric, unquote, and branding them as anti-Muslim, with the goal of getting those shows yanked from the air instead of just having their own shows or countering the viewpoints. CARE's been fairly successful in varying degrees in ruining reputations, getting people fired, intimidating stations, and persuading sponsors to withdraw money. CARE also works to get TV censored, whether it's the award-winning fictional TV series 24 Hours by Fox, which wound up cutting scenes as a result of CARE's protests, or whether it's actual news. For example, CARE New York demanded that CBS stop airing all films, TV, and radio shows on the subject of Islamic terrorism, whether it was fact or fiction. They emphasized that it defamed Muslims and subjected poor little innocent children to harassment on the playground and in school. Toward that end, CARE New York launched an online petition to boycott all of CBS radio and TV in both their entertainment divisions, but also their news divisions, and to boycott all CBS advertisers. In the arena of national security and law enforcement, CARE works to censor training. In 2008, a film titled The Third Jihad, Radical Islam's Vision for America, came out. It was narrated by a Muslim and interviewed many credible national security experts, including then Police Commissioner Ray Kelly, the former Mayor Giuliani, Walid Perez, who's a counterterrorism expert, and former CIA Director James Woolsey. The film was used as part of the NYPD counterterrorism training program. CARE protested the film, saying that it was, quote, biased, simply because it associated some interpretations of Islam with terrorism, even though it's true. But CARE's real agenda was to dismantle the NYPD training program because it was one of the best counterterrorism training programs in the country. CARE demanded an investigation of why the, quote, anti-Islam film was used in the training and insisted on new guidelines that would disallow religious content that it deemed biased. Eventually, the NYPD capitulated and dropped the film from its training program.